My sister stood at the plaintiff's table and told the judge with complete certainty that Grandpa Jean's bakery and the delivery van were always meant for her family. Her husband sat beside her with his hands folded on the table, like a man waiting for a business meeting to conclude in his favor. My mother was in the gallery behind them, wearing the gray cardigan she saves for occasions she considers important. My father sat next to her, arms crossed the way he always crosses them when he's already made up his mind about something. I sat at the defendant's table with my lawyer and kept my hands flat on the wood so no one could see them shake. My sister's attorney spoke smoothly. He described me as isolated, emotionally fragile under the weight of the business, resistant to reasonable family cooperation. He said I had verbally indicated on multiple occasions that Grandpa Jean's bakery was a shared family asset, and that I had withdrawn that understanding due to stress and what he called, with a sympathetic tilt of his head, financial anxiety. He said, my sister and her husband simply wanted what was fair. He said the word fair 3 times in the first 10 minutes. My sister pressed a folded tissue to the corner of her eye. Judge Nakamura, a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses pushed halfway down her nose, listened without changing expression. She flipped through the documents in front of her. Then she stopped. Her hand pressed flat against one page. She lifted her head slowly and she did not look at my sister. She did not look at the attorney. She looked at me. Before we proceed, she said, her voice even and unhurried, I want to understand something. Your sister's counsels made specific claims about statements you allegedly made. Do you intend to contest those claims? Or does the defense have evidence the court has not yet reviewed? My sister turned her head toward me, just slightly. My mother's hands tightened in her lap. My father uncrossed his arms, then crossed them again. I looked at Mr. Vega. He gave me a small nod. Yes, Your Honor, I said. There's quite a bit the court hasn't seen yet. Natalie's jaw moved the way it used to when we were kids, and something wasn't going the way she planned. I thought, you should have walked away when I asked you to. To understand how I ended up in that courtroom, you have to go back further than Grandpa Jean. You have to go back to the kind of family I grew up in, and what it teaches a child when her job, from the very beginning, is simply to make room. Natalie is 3 years younger than me. From the time she could walk, my parents treated that age gap like a permanent excuse for everything. She was younger. She needed more help. She hadn't had as long to figure things out. These were the explanations I got whenever I noticed the difference in how we were treated, and I noticed it early. When Natalie was in middle school, she got into competitive cheerleading. My parents drove her to practices 4 nights a week and every Saturday morning. They bought matching team jackets and learned the names of every girl on the squad and every coach and the parents of every coach. They rearranged vacations around her competition schedule. I ran cross-country in high school. They came to one meet my freshman year, stood at the finish line, long enough to see me cross it, and left before I had my shoes off. My father had to pick Natalie up from a friend's house. That was the reason. There was always a reason. I learned to be useful instead of noticed. I cooked dinner twice a week by the time I was 13 because my mother was exhausted from the driving. I kept my grades high without being asked. I babysat Natalie during the summers without being paid and called it normal because everyone in the house had decided it was. The moment that changed how I understood my family happened when I was 16. Natalie had borrowed my car. She didn't have her license yet, but she wanted to drive to a friend's house 2 streets over, and I was tired of arguing with her, so I handed her the keys and told her to be careful. She wasn't careful. She backed the car into the neighbor's mailbox, scraped the rear bumper, and drove home without telling me. When my father saw the damage that evening, he stood in the driveway looking at the scrape for a long time. Then he came inside and asked me what happened. I started to explain, but Natalie cut in before I could finish. She said she'd seen me back out of the driveway too fast that morning. She said she'd been worried about how I drove. She said this with her head slightly tilted and her voice soft with concern. My father looked at me. Is that true? I said no. I said she was the one who borrowed the car. I said she didn't have her license. He turned back to Natalie. She shrugged and looked at the floor. I don't know why she's saying that. He grounded me for 2 weeks. He told me I was irresponsible. He told me I should know better than to drive carelessly with the cost of repairs the way they were. Natalie watched me from the kitchen doorway as he lectured me. She didn't smirk. She didn't need to. The fact that I was standing there, and she was standing there, and no one was asking any more questions was enough. That night I sat in my room and understood something clearly for the first time. Defending myself made it worse. The more I said, the more it looked like I was trying to shift blame, and the more my father's voice hardened. Silence was safer. Silence didn't give them anything to argue against. I carried that with me for years. Silence as armor, silence as survival. High school passed. I worked part-time at a grocery store through my junior and senior years and kept the money in an account my parents didn't know about. When I graduated, my parents threw Natalie a party for finishing sophomore year and called it a mid-high school celebration. My graduation dinner was the 4 of us at a chain restaurant. My mother ordered the salmon. My father checked his phone twice. I got into a state school on a partial scholarship and worked 2 jobs to cover the rest. Natalie got a private college paid in full by my parents. She has more potential, my father said once, not cruelly, just matter-of-factly, the way you might describe the weather. I didn't argue. I had learned not to. Grandpa Gene was my mother's father, and the only person in my family who ever seemed to actually see me. He had run a small bakery in town for almost 30 years, not the kind of place with artisan sourdough and oat milk lattes, just a square brick building on a corner lot with a hand-painted sign, a glass case full of pastries, and a back room that smelled permanently of butter and vanilla. He sold coffee, muffins, sandwich rolls, sheet cakes for birthday orders. He had a white delivery van he used for catering drop-offs and wholesale orders to 2 diners nearby. He had been running it alone since my grandmother died, and in the last few years, the business had slowed. I used to help him on Saturdays when I was in high school, not because anyone asked me to, but because I liked being there. He paid me in pastries and conversation, and both were worth more than the grocery store ever paid me in cash. Natalie came once. She sat on a stool for 40 minutes, said it smelled weird, and never came back. Grandpa Gene passed away in February of last year, a Tuesday morning, quiet. He had been declining since the fall, and we all knew it was coming, but it still felt like something knocked out of the air when my mother called to tell me. He had met with his attorney in November, 2 months before he died, and left a handwritten addendum to his will. The bakery, the equipment, the delivery van, and the property lease transferred to me. There was a short note in the envelope. It said, "You showed up every Saturday for 6 years. You swept the floor without being asked, and you learned how to pipe frosting, and you never once complained. The shop should belong to someone who knows what it costs to build it. That's you." My family's reaction was swift and unanimous. My father said the building was old and the neighborhood wasn't what it used to be, and I should sell quickly before the lease became a liability. My mother said it was a kind gesture from Grandpa Gene but not practical to hold on to. Natalie said nothing, but her husband Craig said, at the family dinner after the funeral, That it was too bad the old man hadn't thought about what a family could do with that kind of asset. He said family like he was laying down a card. I took the keys and drove over the following weekend. I stood in the doorway for a while before I went in. The glass case was empty. The display shelves were dusty. There was a crack in the tile behind the counter, and the reach-in refrigerator made a sound like it was thinking about giving up. The delivery van in the back lot had a slow leak in the rear left tire. I stood there and thought about my grandfather piping frosting at 5 in the morning and I thought about how no one else in my family had ever come to see this place. And I thought about the 6 years of Saturdays I had spent in the back room, listening to him explain the difference between cake flour and all-purpose. I started cleaning. The first month was just cleanup. I scrubbed every surface. I repaired the tile behind the counter with grout I bought at the hardware store and watched 3 YouTube tutorials to figure out how to apply it. I repainted the walls a warm cream and restrung the overhead lights. I had the van's tire patched and the oil changed and the brakes inspected. And I bought a can of touch-up paint for a rust spot along the back door. Learning to bake at a commercial level was harder than cleaning. I had helped Grandpa Gene hundreds of times, but helping is different from running. I enrolled in an online pastry course and practiced in the evenings after work. I woke up at 4 in the morning on weekends to practice laminating dough because it took me weeks to get it right. My first dozen croissants came out of the oven, looking like someone had tried to describe the shape from memory. My hands cracked from the constant flour and washing. I kept a tube of hand cream next to the sink and used it so often it became a reflex. My first week open, I had 9 customers. I made $37 in a single day and felt more satisfied than I had ever felt at my office job. I started posting on Instagram, not polished, professional content, just photos of what was in the case each morning, time-stamped by the platform, tagged with the neighborhood. People shared them. A food blogger who lived 4 blocks away posted a picture of my almond croissant with a caption that said "hidden gem," and I had a line out the door the following Saturday. The delivery van started moving again. I picked up a wholesale account with a coffee shop 2 miles away, then a second. I started taking my orders for corporate breakfast catering, driving the van myself, loading and unloading trays in parking garages at 7 in the morning before the office buildings opened. My back ached constantly. My alarm went off at 3:45 every weekday. Some nights I sat in the empty bakery after closing and ate whatever hadn't sold and stared at the spreadsheet on my laptop and felt, for the first time in my adult life, like something I was doing actually mattered. I didn't tell my family how well it was going. When my mother called to ask how the bakery was doing, I said fine. When Natalie texted to check in, I replied with a thumbs up and changed the subject. I wasn't being secretive. I just knew that interest from that direction only moved in one direction, and it wasn't toward me. The first sign came about 8 months in. My mother called on a Thursday evening and said she'd heard the bakery was busy. She'd run into a woman at her book club who had been to a Saturday morning. She said it the way people say things when they want you to know they've been paying attention. I said thanks and the conversation moved on, but the call stayed with me. 2 weeks later, Natalie showed up at the bakery with Craig. They came in during a slow Tuesday afternoon. Craig looked around the way people look at property they're thinking about buying. Natalie touched the edge of the glass case and said, "Oh, you've really done a lot with it." She said it warmly, genuinely, and somehow that made it worse. Craig got to the point faster than I expected. He said he had some experience in business operations, that he'd been thinking about ways the bakery could grow, that it was a lot for one person to handle alone. He said they could help with the business side, the accounting, the marketing, maybe even a second location eventually. I told him I wasn't looking for partners. He smiled and said he understood, but to keep it in mind. They left. The text came 4 days later from Natalie's phone. She wrote that the whole family thought it was only fair after everything, that the business support the whole family. She wrote that Grandpa Gene would have wanted that. She wrote that she had kids to think about, a mortgage, real financial pressure, and that I was in a position to help. I replied, "The bakery is mine, I'm not looking to share it." She didn't respond for 3 days. Then Craig called and told me I was being selfish. He said I'd told him once at a family dinner that I always wanted to do something like this with family. He said I'd made that clear more than once. He said, if I wasn't willing to be reasonable, he would make sure I understood the legal implications of walking away from a verbal agreement. I had never said any such thing. I hung up. My hands were shaking again, the same way they'd shaken in the driveway when I was 16, and my father believed Natalie over me. I sat on the floor of the bakery storeroom for a while, next to the 50-pound bags of flour, and I thought about what I was going to do. Then I opened my contacts and called a lawyer. Mr. Vega had been recommended by a colleague at my office. He listened to everything I told him without interrupting. When I finished, he said the claim was weak, but not impossible to file, and that I needed to start documenting everything immediately. He told me to keep every text, every voicemail, every email. He told me that if Craig called again, I could record the call, that Oregon, where I lived, was a one-party consent state. Craig called again 10 days later. I recorded it. The envelope with the court documents arrived on a Wednesday. Natalie and Craig were filing for unjust enrichment and specific performance, claiming that Grandpa Gene had always intended for the business to be a family assets, and that I had verbally agreed to manage it on behalf of the family, then reneged. Attached were signed affidavits from my mother and my father, both stating they had been present at conversations where I expressed my intention to share the business. I read the affidavits twice. My parents had written sentences I had never said, attributed to conversations I did not remember, because they had not happened. They had signed their names underneath. I went into work the next morning. I taught my assistant how to open the cases without me, in case I needed to be somewhere else. I drove the van to the coffee shop delivery. I came home and sat at my kitchen table and did not cry, because I had learned a long time ago that crying changed nothing. Then I got back to work. The courtroom. Natalie's attorney presented his case for almost 2 hours. Craig testified first, voice steady, describing conversations that had never taken place. He spoke about how concerned he was for my well-being, how the stress of running the business alone was visibly affecting me, how I had seemed desperate for family support in the early days. He said I had explicitly mentioned wanting to share the work and the success with family, that he had witnesses. My father took the stand next. He sat straight and spoke carefully, the way he always does when he wants to seem measured. He said, the bakery had become valuable in a way none of them had anticipated, and that it would be a shame for one branch of the family to benefit entirely from a grandfather who had loved all of them. He said Natalie had children to raise and real obligations. He did not look at me. My mother spoke last for the plaintiff's side. She said she had always worried about me pushing too hard. She said she had heard me express uncertainty about managing the business alone. She said she signed the affidavit because she believed it reflected what she had understood to be true. The room felt like it was tilting toward them. A few people in the gallery shifted. I watched the judge's face and could not read it. Then Mr. Vega stood up. He spoke quietly, the way certain people speak when they know they don't need volume. He said he wanted to walk the court through a timeline. The first document he submitted was the text thread between Natalie and me. He pointed out that the first message requesting a share of the business arrived 9 months after the bakery reopened, 6 months after the Instagram following started growing, and 4 months after the wholesale coffee shop accounts were secured. There was no message, no email, no record of any kind from before the bakery began showing profit, not a single one. He showed the financial records next. Every invoice from the equipment suppliers, every receipt from the flour wholesaler, the butter distributor, the pastry packaging company, every payment for the Instagram promoted posts, the commercial insurance renewal, the van's inspection and repair. All of it in my name. All of it from my account. Not a single payment, contribution, or investment from Natalie or Craig, or my parents in any amount, at any point. Craig shifted in his seat. Then Mr. Vega placed a small speaker on the table. He said it was a recording of a phone call between Craig and me, made legally under state law, approximately 3 weeks before the court documents arrived. Craig's voice filled the room. He sounded different than he had on the stand. He sounded impatient. He said, "You need to stop making this difficult. We can do this the easy way, or we can do it the way that gets ugly. You can't keep all of it. You know that. Sign the paperwork and let Natalie and me come on as co-owners, or I promise you this goes somewhere you won't like." He said a few more things. Then the recording ended. The courtroom was quiet. My mother turned her head and looked at the floor. My father put his hand over his mouth. Natalie looked at Craig. Craig stared at the table in front of him. Judge Nakamura looked at Craig for a long moment. Then she took off her reading glasses and held them. "Mr." she said, and used Craig's last name. "You testified that your motivation in filing this action was concern for the plaintiff's well-being and a desire for family. I have just heard you, in your own voice, threaten litigation as a lever to compel a property transfer. Those are not consistent positions." Craig opened his mouth. "You'll have the opportunity to respond," the judge said, and her tone made clear that the opportunity would be limited. Mr. Vega asked to present one final piece of evidence. He explained that Grandpa Gene, when he met with his attorney in November, had left a sealed letter to be held in the attorney's care. The letter was to remain sealed unless the ownership of the bakery was contested in a court proceeding. The attorney had turned the letter over to Mr. Vega upon filing of the plaintiff's action. He handed it to the clerk, who handed it to the judge. Judge Nakamura read it without expression, then she read it again. She looked up. "I'm going to read a portion of this letter into the record," she said. She cleared her throat. The letter states, in part, "I am leaving the bakery and the van to my granddaughter because she is the only member of this family who ever treated the work as something worth respecting. She came every Saturday for 6 years. She learned the craft. She stayed late and asked questions. And she never once asked what was in it for her. My other grandchildren and my children did not come. I do not say this with bitterness. I say it so that if anyone disputes this decision, the court will know that I did not make it carelessly." The judge set the letter down. "The handwritten will is unambiguous," she said. "The sealed letter confirms the testator's intent and reasoning. The financial records demonstrate sole investment and management. The communications submitted by the defense show that contact demanding a share of the business began exclusively after the business became profitable. And the recording submitted by the defense shows the plaintiff's representative using litigation as a threat to compel property transfer, which this court does not consider consistent with good faith family concern." She looked at Natalie. The claim is denied. Ownership of the bakery, the delivery van, and the associated lease remains entirely with the defendant. She looked at Craig. Furthermore, given the nature of the recorded communication, this court is ordering the plaintiff to cover the defendant's legal fees in full. Any further attempt to contest, harass, or interfere with the defendant's ownership will result in additional proceedings and potential civil penalties. The gavel came down once. The room exhaled around me. I stood and Mr. Vega touched my arm and said, "We had done well." I thanked him. Natalie and Craig were speaking in low, urgent voices at their table. My mother had her hand pressed flat over her heart. My father was staring at the front of the room like he was waiting for something to change. Judge Nakamura had begun to gather her papers. Before she rose, she glanced over at me one more time. I asked if I could address the court briefly. She nodded. I turned and looked at my parents, at Natalie, at Craig. They all looked smaller than they had that morning. "I've spent a long time being the responsible one," I said. "Not because I wanted that title, because it was assigned to me when I was young enough that I didn't know I could push back on it. I worked 2 jobs through college. I moved into a studio apartment with a broken heater because it was what I could afford. I spent 6 Saturday mornings a month in that bakery for 6 years because my grandfather asked me and because I loved him. No one else came. No one asked to." My mother looked down. "You signed statements saying I was overwhelmed, that I couldn't manage it alone. But I have managed it alone from the first day, while you were deciding whether it was worth your attention. You only showed up when it started making money. I want the court to know that I am not angry about that. I am just done with explaining myself to people who have already decided what I am." I sat back down. Judge Nakamura rose. The bailiff called the room to order. Then it was over. I drove the van back to the bakery that evening. The last delivery of the day had gone out hours earlier, and my assistant had locked up. I unlocked the front door and went inside without turning on the main lights, just the small lamp above the pass-through to the kitchen, the one Grandpa Jean had installed himself with the wrong size fixture, so it always sat slightly crooked. I sat on the stool behind the counter. The glass case was empty and clean. The reach-in refrigerator hummed quietly. The van was in the back lot with a full tank of gas and new wiper blades I'd had installed the week before. My phone buzzed on the counter 3 times. Natalie, Craig, my mother. I picked it up and blocked them, one by one, on every platform, every number. I did it without hesitation, without a goodbye message, without an explanation. There was nothing left to explain. Word travels in a small town, and it traveled. Within a few weeks, people who knew my family heard pieces of what had happened. Craig's name came up when it shouldn't have. Natalie stopped being mentioned warmly at the book club my mother attended. I didn't follow any of it. I heard things secondhand, from my assistant, from a regular customer who knew everyone, and I listened and nodded and then went back to work. My father called once from a number I didn't recognize. I listened to the voicemail. He said he thought things had gone too far, and that family was still family. He said it the way people say things when they've lost and are looking for a door back in. I deleted the voicemail and didn't return the call. By spring, the bakery had a second wholesale account and a waiting list for custom cake orders that ran 6 weeks out. I hired a second part-time baker, a woman who had trained at a pastry school in Portland and wanted weekday morning hours while her kids were in school. I showed her how Grandpa Jean had organized the storeroom, the way he labeled everything by date in black marker, and she said it was a good system. Some evenings after close, I'd sit on the stool behind the counter in the quiet, and think about the 6-year-old version of me who used to stand in the back room, watching my grandfather measure flour into a bowl. He would always let me pour in the last scoop. He said it was because I had a steady hand. I still do. I think about him often, in that building he spent 30 years in, and I know he knew exactly what he was doing when he left it to me. Not because I was the most deserving, or the most talented, or the most anything, because I showed up. I kept showing up for years, without being asked and without reward, because the work itself was enough. That's still true. Every morning at 3:45, when the alarm goes off and the apartment is dark and cold, and the bakery is waiting, I get up. And I go.